Hello and welcome to this episode of the Housing Geospatial podcast, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything that relates to either housing and or geospatial, preferably if there's a little bit of both. Housing Geospatial was formed as we believe that place matters for social housing and that geospatial information is woefully underrepresented in the housing sector. This series is around sharing a collective knowledge for us in the housing sector. You can find us either on our group page on LinkedIn or feel free to head on over to our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk. I'm your host, Chris Kinnear, and our guest for this episode is the amazingly innovative Lucy Lyons, who is the co-founder and CEO of Kestrix. Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Amazing. So, first of all, how are you involved in either housing and or geospatial?
So I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Kestrix. And what we do at Kestrix is basically we fly thermal imaging drones over housing stock. And we've got algorithms that basically take those images captured by drones, turn them into 3D models, and use those 3D models to generate retrofit plans. So we're enabling sort of empirical data for assets at scale, but that empirical data is geo-referenced. So that's sort of our interaction with geospatial.
Okay, and we'll get onto your housing link later on in the episode. You've had a really interesting career that led to you co-founding Kestrix. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So rather than having any background in geospatial, my background was always in sort of tech and climate, and really the intersection of tech and climate. So I graduated from a degree in sort of politics and urban design. So always was sort of passionate about buildings. But my first job after founding a first startup that didn't end up working out was in a company that helped other companies calculate their carbon emissions. So I was always really, motivated to help the private sector sort of solve climate change. And I felt that emissions tracking was a good way to sort of start on that journey. So was an early employee at Plan A, which was one of the largest carbon accounting firms in Germany. So worked with lots of clients to sort of understand their carbon footprints and figure out how to reduce their carbon footprints. And yeah, it was really in sort of doing that I realized that particularly when it comes to buildings and real estate, which represents sort of 40% of emissions, if you think about heating and cooling buildings and also building them, these clients didn't really have access to that granular of data about particularly where heat loss was happening. And yeah, there's basically more than 100 billion euros lost annually through heat escaping through poorly insulated buildings, and that's just in Europe. So we had quite a lot of real estate clients who said that this was a problem. And so when I met Matt, my co-founder, and he sort of proposed a solution that would solve this data bottleneck for the built environment, I thought, gosh, this sounds like a really good idea. So that's sort of how I got to Kestrix. But it's always interesting being sort of a person with a non-technical background in a very technical discipline. My whole team is coming from sort of the engineering world, and I definitely come from a place of I want to apply my skills to do something about climate change. And this is just sort of where I've landed.
Okay, so that's really cool knowing, and I didn't realize it's a billion euros annually. That's a huge amount of money.
100 billion.
100 billion, sorry, yeah.
So to break down that statistic, basically what we're talking about here is how much value is lost from poorly performing buildings that are just not insulated well, losing heat unnecessarily. And it's 100 billion euros in value, and that's just in Europe. So if we insulated all of our buildings, that's kind of how much we could save as a whole economy, not to mention the carbon emissions, of which I'd say, poorly insulated buildings contributing to something like 10-15% of emissions in total.
So that's a massive percentage. So obviously, and you said in the first question how you're the founder and you use drones and algorithms to look at heat loss within buildings. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically the way that Kestrix works is we fly sort of drones over buildings. So let's say one house, or we do this sort of 50 houses at a time or more. But per one house, what really happens is we collect two sets of images. So number one, thermal imaging during the nighttime when it's cold, and when the heating is on. And then we capture one set of images during the day, basically when it's sunny, so we can see basically all the sort of materials that the building is made of. So what our technology fundamentally does is we take those raw images, we sort of stitch them on top of each other, overlaying thermal and RGB, and we run a bunch of analysis on that sort of integrated 3D model. So we try to basically understand what is the thermal imaging telling us based on the sort of materials of the building, based on how far away the drone is from the building at the time of image capture, all this stuff. So yeah, I like to say, like, in the same way that there's an MRI machine that takes the image, there's typically software that helps diagnose the disease. The drone is like the MRI machine, and we're kind of like the AI on top of it that makes the call, makes the sort of diagnosis about heat loss, and recommends sort of the best remedy or retrofit pathway.
That is really, really cool. And I love the idea of using the thermal imaging at night to identify more of like the heat escaping, which I think I hadn't really thought about that until you just mentioned it now. So that's a really clever way. So you've got the imaging and you've got the two layers over together. Can you tell us a bit more about how you do that to get, because there's a great quote I love, which is how you describe yourselves to wanting to become the Google Maps of heat loss. So can you tell us a bit more about when you get those two overlays together and like how, like what kind of output do you get from that?
Sure. So I mean, we're sort of on this journey to become the Google Maps of heat loss. We want to democratize access to data that helps everyone plan and prioritize which homes to retrofit and then verify retrofit outcomes. I'd say the sort of first real world example of this is we've got a multi-year partnership with E.ON, the big utility, whereby we have flown the drones now over around 6,000 houses in one part of Coventry. And this is basically to help Coventry City Council better allocate scarce retrofit resources. So, Coventry City Council basically has their own targets around sort of retrofit. They've got their allocation of retrofit funding. And the question we're really trying to answer by providing a neighborhood-wide heat loss map and retrofit plan is where are the opportunities, right? So where can we get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of retrofitting? So what the council and E.ON actually can do with our data is see sort of at the scale of 6,000 houses, where are the opportunities? How many uninsulated solid walls are there based on the conservation area constraints? If there are any, can we install EWI, which is exterior wall insulation? Can we instead install IWI, interior wall insulation? It's questions like that. How many uninsulated lofts are there? And then ultimately, what is the thermal performance uplift potential? So if you did invest this amount in this many retrofits, what would be the ultimate outcome? What would be the average sort of bill savings for residents? What would be the implications for fuel poverty? These are all questions that we need human beings to answer. But if human beings don't have accurate inputs and data, then it's very hard for them to answer these questions, and therefore hard to efficiently allocate what we know is very scarce resource when we're talking about retrofit.
That is really cool. And I hadn't realized all that when we talked previously, but that's one of the things I really like is how when you do the insulation and you suggest the potential cost of doing that and that kind of cost benefit ratio. This is going to be an offhand question. I don't know if you know off the top of your head, but have you gone to inspect a home, for example, and done your analysis and you found that the EPC is different than the official certificate?
It's a really great question. So I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, thermal imaging and 3D reconstruction is not part of the EPC because this is really new technology, right? And so a big question that our customers have been asking us, so social housing providers, is basically how can we interrogate our EPC data using empirical Kestrix data? So to help them answer this question, we've been working really hard on developing a feature called which we call basically an EPC comparator. So what we've done is we've reverse engineered SAP and try and basically come up with what are all the things that impact a SAP score or an EPC rating. And we've tried to see, okay, which of these things can Kestrix affect and tell us about. So the most obvious is, okay, the U value of a solid wall. That's an assumed insulated or uninsulated based on the EPC, and that has an effect on the SAP score. We can tell you actually, is it insulated or not, and what's the sort of quality of the install, and then what's the actual estimated U value. So that's an example of how we affect the EPC. But in addition to that, there's other things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, like what are the dimensions of all the walls and the windows, and what's the wall to window ratio. That's something that we can also tell our customers because we're not doing just heat loss assessment. We're also understanding geometric values, from our RGB imagery. So that's something we're working on. We plan to launch this in the first half of this year. We're doing beta testing now with a couple of our customers, but that's where we're trying to get to, right? Is back to your question. We're trying to help the customer understand, okay, what is actually the real data, but then what does the real data tell me about the lodged data and the predicted data? And what we're ultimately trying to help our customers do is gain confidence in their strategies, right? So we know that the industry has to go based on EPCs. How can we help them do that with more confidence is really our question.
I think that's really fascinating. The bit I really like, and maybe I should have thought about this more, but in terms of your response going, well, actually, we can't influence it directly, but from reading EPCs, you go, oh, it's got loft insulation, it's got wall insulation. But if it's only partial coverage, yeah, the theory certificate could be C or B, but if it's only got partial coverage or there's huge gaps within it, or the dimensions of the building don't allow it to be massively insulating, well, actually, it's going to effectively be a lower score than what it practically is. I think that's really, really cool. And I think a lot of housing providers would get huge benefit from that, especially when you target that with how you can genuinely support a retrofit program, which I think is really, really cool. So the next kind of big question is, you have surveyed loads of homes so far. How many homes do you think you've surveyed, and what's the kind of scale that you'd like to go up to?
Definitely. So time of recording here is still technically the cold season, although we're starting to see some warming up. That's a bit earlier than anticipated. But that means that we're actively mapping right now. So the actual number is somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 homes, depending on how many the drone providers have covered today. We're just in the middle of doing another 2,000 for one customer right now. And that's basically homes that the drone has flown over. We've had to sort of in parallel with capturing this volume of homes, build the pipeline that takes 2D images and turns them into fully aligned 3D models in a way that's quick and reliable, which has been quite a journey over the last couple of years. But now we do have the volume of sort of training data to make that much faster. So we're now at the point where we're processing hundreds of properties per week, with the potential to process thousands of properties per week, sort of by the middle of this year. So we're really in a sort of gear up mode. It's interesting. I mean, I think in some respects, I talk about hitting the 10,000 home milestone, and it feels significant. But at the same time, we have 29 million homes just in the UK, of which most need some sort of retrofit. If we think about Europe, we're talking about hundreds of millions of homes. And that's really the engine that we're trying to build. Like, we don't want to just be a surveying company that processes 10,000 a year. We want to get to a point where we're actually mapping a significant portion of the country, of the continent, because that's when you really do hit sort of that Google Maps of heat loss inflection point. We map today on demand from our customers, but we want to get to a point where, perhaps we've done some mapping work for a social housing provider, but a financier could use that data, for different reasons, but same data set, right? And of course, we're making sure that we're selling the data only for the purposes of retrofit planning, pricing, verification, engagement. But there's different use cases there. There's different stakeholders. Like, we want to be the center of the sort of table that everybody sits around, that sort of single source of truth. So yeah, I would say 10,000 homes probably is a milestone we've passed or about to pass. But we're just getting started. We're really trying to build the infrastructure to process at scale.
I absolutely love that ambition. And I still think your quote of being the Google Maps of heat loss is phenomenal. So one of the things that we really interestingly talked about the other week was how things have changed since you've begun Kestrix. Could you take our listeners through that journey that we were talking about what's not practically changed versus what has practically changed?
Sure. So I think maybe just to start with the macro trends and the market, what's practically changed? Well, there's been obviously a change of government, and a change of government means a change of sort of plan and policy. And we've seen that with labor coming in. Obviously, we've seen the energy company obligation eco scheme scrapped, which was a bit is an understatement, which was a serious blow to the industry. And we have seen the effects of that. I think there are quite a lot of installers whose pipeline are sort of uncertain because the program is ending. I think, yeah, on the flip side, we have seen the Warm Homes Plan come out, which is promising. It's a 15 billion pound program for retrofit for social housing and otherwise over the course of the next few years. I would say for Kestrix, there's definitely been a de-emphasis on sort of insulation and what we call fabric measures, which is, yeah, I mean, I suppose my personal view and perhaps the view of Kestrix is that every home is different, and an energy upgrade that works well for one home, perhaps an air source heat pump, doesn't work well for another that is namely not properly insulated. So we maintain the view that even if there is more funding for air source heat pumps, that our customers should be understanding air source heat pump feasibility in the context not just of where does the heat pump go on the outside of the house, which is something we can also tell our customers, but what's the thermal performance of the house, and is the heat pump going to have to work way too hard in this building? So even though there's been sort of, I'd say, a de-emphasis on insulation, yeah, we still like to guide our customers through the journey of, okay, assess the homes holistically. Obviously, in the past, that's been difficult and not necessarily very scalable. But that's what we're trying to fix at Kestrix. The idea is you can scan thousands of properties with us, and you can know very specifically what's the recipe for each one. But yeah, I mean, I think we started very much as a thermal performance assessment evaluation company, understanding which insulation should go where, but we've definitely evolved into a company that assesses retrofit potential for the home. So we do a thermal performance assessment, but we also do air source heat pump siting. We do solar PV potential. So we are trying to holistically answer questions about the building. So I'd say that's changed a lot in the last 2 years. In terms of like internally, I'd say biggest sort of gains for us on the technical side have been, number one, around actual algorithmic outputs. So we've our rapid thermal performance assessment algorithm, which estimates U values without readings of internal temperature, is now patent pending. We've won almost £1 million in Innovate UK funding to support directly the development of this capability. So this is kind of our, I would say our unique differentiator. And I think, yeah, secondly is just around processing speed and capacity. It's, I think, very hard to understand without going into sort of the mechanics of how Kestrix works, that this journey of 2D images from the drone into these 3D models is complicated. But it is very complicated, and we've been definitely facing a sort of bottleneck in terms of how fast can we turn 2D into 3D for the past couple of years. But this has been a serious focus of ours because we understand that to achieve our ambitions, we need to be processing a lot faster and a lot more volume. So this has been a real focus, and we are proudly now at the point where we can process hundreds of models per week, which is going to help make our customers happy and enable sort of analysis at a bigger scale.
Yeah, I remember during my masters, one of my friends did like a little stone hut, and that took him like a week of rendering and processing. So
yes, but it's like who would have thought, right? Like I think
yeah.
Again, as a layperson before coming into Kestrix, it never would have occurred to me, and this is perhaps naivete, which can sometimes be a good thing, but it just never would have occurred to me that this would be the bottleneck. But I think very few people are aware of the challenges of sort of 3D reconstruction, particularly when you introduce thermal imaging. There is no off-the-shelf tool to align visible spectrum and thermal images in a 3D model. And I think with this all the talk about AI and how fast it's progressing, something like that gets lumped in, and people generally tend to think, how hard can it be? Turns out it is indeed very, very hard. I would imagine a lot of people on the Geospatial podcast have a unique appreciation for that, being sort of in the weeds, but it's been definitely something we've focused on. But I think we are now at the point where we have focused on it. So we are a very good partner for this work, because we've gone through lots of learnings. But I'd say if somebody doesn't throw caution to the wind on that topic, they probably haven't gotten too far into it.
How do you feel drone technology and kind of imaging technology has changed since you began? Has it stayed relatively constant, or are you finding that like the cameras are getting that much better, or the drones are getting that much better?
So there's kind of three facets to this. There's the actual drones themselves, which I'll talk about. There's the thermal imaging cameras, which go on top of the drones, which that's all about sensors and how they're evolving. And then there's actually the regulatory landscape and how that's changing to enable sort of different activities. I'd say, I mean, there's massive progress in sort of the general area of drones. Like drones are getting smaller and lighter and quieter and faster and cheaper, longer battery life. I'm not the drone expert. Full disclosure, my co-founder probably could speak to that a lot better than I can. But DJI in China is a behemoth of a company and is constantly putting out new products. There's a change going on right now, transition from the Mavic 3T Enterprise to the 4T. I might be getting the names wrong, actually. But I guess this goes to show Kestrix is a software company that uses drone inputs, not a drone company. Although we've got some drone nerds on our team, I'm probably not the right person. But anyway, the tech is moving very fast. I think what hampers, the progress though is the regulatory landscape. We have seen some progress around sort of regulations, and we're trying to slipstream behind the lobbying work that the likes of Amazon are doing to enable sort of autonomous drone delivery. But we are still in a place where two people are required to be on the ground overseeing a drone. So even if we're pre-programming a flight plan, which we do, there still needs to be people on site. And that's really the bottleneck. Like we could technically there is technology out there to enable drone in the box, sort of drones sit there, they come out at the right time when the weather's perfect, go around and capture all the images, come back. But in reality, this is not possible because of CAA restrictions or FAA restrictions. Sorry, I'm in the US. CAA, FAA equivalents across the pond. And I think lastly, in terms of sort of thermal imaging sensors, this is probably the area I know least about. But this has progressed over the past, I'd say more like decade, such that basically you can capture thermal imaging that's higher resolution, but we haven't actually seen huge gains in that respect in the last, I'd say, 2 years that we've been mapping, but that might change. That's a hardware question though. So I hope that sort of answers your question. But again, I'm
Yeah,
not the expert. I do want to throw caution to the wind that I'm within Kestrix probably the worst person to ask about that.
No,
But these are
that was
the
just
murmurs that I hear.
me being my nerdy self wanting to know if it's changed, because it's fascinating, especially the regulatory aspect. Um, the big thing that I really wanted to chat about, how you're involved with housing. You have recently completed a project with Peabody. Please tell us more about that and all the lessons learned and everything else from it.
Definitely. So I mean, the challenge that any data company will always have is everybody loves good data. But the question that sometimes people can't answer is what is the data actually for and what is the value that we're trying to create with the data? And I think our recent work with Peabody really started to answer this question for Kestrix in an exciting way. So maybe to recap, Peabody is one of our first customers. They're the third largest social housing provider in the country, overseeing something like 103,000 properties, maybe more. And obviously very historic and also real leaders around sort of innovation. So when we reached out to Peabody about 3 years ago and asked them to be a partner on the first Innovate UK grant that we won, £250,000 to invest in our rapid thermal performance assessment capabilities. They came on board and they've been excellent partners since. And I think the case study we've published with them is really a culmination of this work. So to recap, what has Kestrix done for Peabody? Basically, Kestrix flew thermal drones over a subset of properties that Peabody planned to retrofit in through the Social Housing Decarbonization Fund. Wave 2, and I think it was 2.2, might have been 2.1. Don't quote me. You'll see it in the case study, though. It's definitely correct there. Yeah, essentially what Kestrix did was we flew the drones over the properties beforehand to assess and visualize thermal performance. The properties were then in turn retrofitted with United Living. And then Kestrix was used again to basically verify the outcomes of the retrofit. So we flew over the properties before they were retrofitted, we flew over the properties after. And what this really enabled us to do is not only visualize, okay, what was the heat loss before and what was the heat loss after, but actually quantify. Can we quantitatively demonstrate that there has been insulation installed and where has it been installed? So we actually did a blind study. Peabody didn't tell us where they were going to be installing retrofits or what they were going to be doing. They said just try to empirically verify before and after. And yeah, we were successful in sort of demonstrating that in this case, loft insulation had been installed and solar PV. It's not that hard to see that in an image, but when you're talking about thousands of properties, you don't want to obviously check. So we can detect solar PV and loft insulation, and we were able to sort of quantify the thermal performance uplift. And essentially take that thermal performance uplift, so that before and after U value differential, and the resulting sort of implications for space heating demand intensity, and estimate that through a combination of solar PV and insulation, the residents should be saving in excess of £500 per year on bills. Demonstrable sort of CO2 savings as well that are associated with that predicted sort of energy use. So I think the estimated average CO2 reduction per annum per home, per annum for the entire program of the subset of homes, about 1.3 tons. So I think it's just in this day and age of estimates and averages, what we really wanted to prove was that we can actually look at the empirical data and make a much more educated guess about what the difference really is. And what that ultimately does is it helps Peabody understand value for money. We invested X in this program with this partner, United Living, and this is basically like a checkbox saying this was the social benefit per pound invested. And I think in a world where there is finite financial resource, it is becoming really important for housing providers to be able to demonstrate to the stakeholders that release that funding, we did a good job. We created value for money. It's also, I think, important in a world where, you have reports coming out from the National Audit Office saying that under the eco scheme, 98% of EWI installs were sort of faulty. I think we can have a broader discussion about the way that study was run and whether it actually reflects reality. But point being, we need more accountability in the sector. And for us to be able to demonstrate to Peabody that United Living did a good job is also really meaningful for Peabody and their relationship with United Living. Like when we talk about pay for performance, how can we make sure that contractors are compensated for good work? This becomes really relevant. So that's what the case study is all about. If you read through it, you can see sort of what was the outcome of the retrofits for Peabody, and also what was sort of the value for money, and then also the methodology we used is all in there. So I'd encourage anyone listening who's interested to check it out. It's on our website. If you just go to kestrix.io, you'll see it up there.
That's awesome, knowing the amount of carbon dioxide that was saved from being entered into the atmosphere, but also around the fuel poverty, households were getting an extra roughly £500 a month back in their pocket. That's
a year.
That's what I meant.
Yes.
£500 a year back in their pocket. That's amazing, for knowing from Peabody that they've done a good work, they've partnered with a good retrofitter, and the fact that you can validate all that as well. I think that's a really powerful project, and anyone who is listening to this should definitely give you a call, in my view, to see if they can replicate that success. We are coming up to the end of our podcast now, and we're doing our great big famous question of, if you had a limited budget, what would you do with it?
Well, I suppose I'm biased, but I think most of your listeners would guess what I would do. I would fly drones over every major city in, well, I was going to say the UK, but maybe just every major city in Europe. And I would build a Google Maps of heat loss. I think we are at the point in the business where we can provide value for social housing. And there's a very clear sort of reason that a social housing provider would hire us to go out and fly drones over their stock. The next step for us is obviously expanding that and flying over every building, because there's so many use cases. I mean, mortgage providers, installers, even estate agents. There's so many stakeholders who could benefit from this data if it were available sort of at a cost-effective price point. So if we had unlimited budget, I would go out and scan every city and run that experiment. We're moving towards being able to do that for some locations, like with Coventry. We've obviously scanned thousands of homes, so we're starting to test that. We've also done over 1,000 in the Isle of Wight, so testing, can that be useful to other people living in the town where we scanned? But that's what I would do with unlimited budget.
My nerdy self would be replicating that completely, just map everything as much as I could and buy all the drones and all the people and all supporting the systems. I think it's truly brilliant what you've been building at Kestrix. I think it's fantastic. We've reached the end of our podcast now, but thank you so much for today, Lucy. It's been amazing and really insightful having you on. If there's anyone who's been listening who wishes to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can email us at hello@kestrix.io. That's probably the easiest. You can also get in touch with me directly on LinkedIn, Lucy Lyons. I'm pretty easy to find. And yeah, we love to hear from geospatial enthusiasts, from housing providers, from really anybody who has a sort of I suppose a view on our work. We love feedback and want to meet anyone who's interested. So definitely do get in touch.
Amazing. And to those of you who've been listening today, thank you so much. If you'd like to get involved in the podcast, please feel free to get in touch. You can find us again either on our website at www.housinggeospatial.co.uk or find us on our LinkedIn page. Lucy, once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much and have a good day.